2 weeks later.
Limited time only. 15 minutes later.
A few hours later.
Much later. A little later. 12 seconds later. 3 annoying songs later. A very boring walk later. 1 scary road later.
A few seconds later. A few seconds later. 1 loading screen later. 1 loading screen later. 47 seconds later. 47 seconds later. 1 hour later. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later. 3 hours later. Many moments later. Many moments later. An eternity later. An eternity later.
A few moments later.
11 minutes later.
1 load screen later. A few moments later.
Several bad puns later. 1 pair of pants later. 3,000 years later. 12 sleepless hours later.
2 hours later.
10 minutes later.
Meanwhile, later.
1,000 years later. A little longer than a few moments later. Meanwhile, you're an idiot.
365 days later.
Just then.
2,000 centuries later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying.
Later that morning. Meanwhile, at the race car time.
1 whole day later. The Patrick and Spengebob running by Yoshi and finally episode The Spengebob SquarePants. The end. 1 leaf later. 1 leaf later.
So one death later, that the old narrator got tired of waiting, and they had to hire a new one.
See next day in a parallel universe. 2,000 years earlier. By sheer coincidence. 1 beautiful Gary's voice later.
A few nanoseconds later.
Hey, announcer there.
Yes, French narrator.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying.
10 minutes later. Would you stop imitating me again? It is starting to get very annoying. An hour later. Soon after. Again. Several hours of boring Samsung Galaxy S for later. Many peaceful hours later. 372 new lows later. Later that Thursday. 1 wishes later. See next day. 1 plan to nap later. 1 feeling weak later. Soon after. With 4 to 6 really imitate weeks. Many worst idiots later. Meanwhile still. Even more meanwhile. The next evening. 1 second later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying.
A few will fit you moments later. Meanwhile at the Errors Picture Studios. Many months of making a new later. Many months of making a new studio later. Many months of making a new house later. Many months of making a new show later. Later that same days. Later that disco night party. 928 seconds later. 2,763 miles later. Later that Wolfie is going to the Errors Pictures' house and Agent Santos and Agent Channel were going to the work. Later, at the P-Head Market, back at the original location.
7 minutes later, another week later, today, 4 days later, limited time only again, previously again, meanwhile, at the robot line. Later, at today very boring then approximately 1 million, zillion, jillion, dillion, cotillion, paranoia, billion years later. 7 weeks later, 9 weeks later, many days later, 4 hours later, 1 hour and 39 minutes later,
50 seconds later. 200 minutes later. A few seconds later. 5.5 minutes later. 8 minutes later. 17 minutes later. 24 minutes later. 8.5 minutes later. 23 seconds later. 1.5 minutes later.
meanwhile, 9 books later, happy 2nd anniversary, 12 months later,
Sometime later.
9 unbearable hours later, you win the idea. Several hours later,
approximately 9 minutes later, later that tomorrow. 7 very boring days later. 3 minutes later. Many moments later. A few weeks later.
a few months later,
7 hours and 7 weeks later.
25 years later, 11 hours later, the next Friday, 6 to 8 hours later, 8 to 12 minutes later, 3 to 5.5 moments later, several scary minutes later, a little longer than a few weeks later, the next week, 4 minutes later, several tic-tacs later, a little longer than a few seconds later, several weeks later, the following Monday, 9 more days later, several years later, a few flowers later, several weekends later, a little longer than a few inches later, 3 minutes later, more hours later, a few moments later, 5 weeks later, the next night, a little longer than a few pants later, day 5, day 6, day 7, 7 to 9 hours later, 9 to 11 months later, 6.5 minutes later, a little longer than a few days later, 2000 hours later, 8.5 inches later, 35 weeks later, 4 seconds later, 5 seconds later,
15 seconds later. 40 inventions later. A ton of weeks later. Many, many weeks later. 200 minutes later. Many unbearable minutes later. 60 minutes later. 4,000 centuries later. 2 minutes earlier. Meanwhile, when it's still going.
meanwhile still,
Day 5. 4 hours later. 11 hours later. Later that morning. Several good later. 15 seconds later. 30 seconds later. A few nanoseconds later. 2 operations later. 8 months later. 164 kilometers later. 1 shift later. 8 hours later. A few days later. 13 minutes later. 45 minutes later. Much later. 5 weeks later. Later that afternoon. Later that day in a parallel universe. 3 hours later again. 1 hour later again. 1 second later. 80,000 impressions later. 47 more seconds later. 4,000 years later. The next morning. The very next morning. Early the next morning. 10 dab to societies later. 60 operations later. An unbelievable performance moments later. Meanwhile, back in the 298 frozen patties later. Many minutes later again. 4 semesters later. 15 winners later. 1 millisecond later. 1 microsecond later.
Many VR plays later.
Would you stop imitating me again? It is starting to get very annoying.
So please, just quit the old one and link is in the description for the new one. And now it's like burning in hell, you know.
365 days later.
분신사바, 분신사바, 오이테 쿠다사이.
After finishing food!
1 full hour of Jingle Bells music later, 70 seconds later, many attempts to fix the microwave later, many attempts to fix the world later, many attempts to fix the movie later, so many parkings cars later, stupid early the very next morning, 15 singles nights of horror later, 4 to 6 centuries later after Yaroslav meets Pinkies and speaking, 34 minutes later after Yaroslav feel wake up in the morning, 1 minute and 7 seconds later after Pinky Gray Simon in their house, 78 inches 37 moments ago, many screamings later, 19.20 minutes later, 14 to 16 and a half days later, many attempts to fix the color later,
So much ago that the old narrator got frustrated again and they had to come back break to this one.
Nice the Wenda failed. I don't know how much minutes later. 96 million crazy minute later. 86 decades 67 hours. 165 minutes and 3 seconds later. Cursed inches later. Several highs later.
So much later that the old narrator got to it and they had to finally to the pinkies.
1 zillion or billion, zillion, nonillion times later. Meanwhile, back in the today, a lot of editor later. 50 songs tracks minutes later. 7:37 a.m. 65 sleepless hours later. 78 minutes later. Several hours later. 6 months ago. Day 94, day 95, day 96. A lot of school later. Years later. The next constituted. A few minutes later. After time, this monitor previously got a few minutes later. Many attempts to fix the hopesters later. 850 minutes later. After Pinky fell asleep on 4:37 am. 8 friends later. Approximately 54 minutes later. Day 98, day 99, day 100 minutes later. Many attempts to fix the gifts later, or after tomorrow, 1 month later, 12 months later, several long years later, many hours later, 97 weeks later, 61 minutes later, 22 days later, 200 crazy minutes later, 40,000 years later, a few angry days later, 5:58 am, 64 days later, the next very night, approximately 5 minutes later. Approximately 4 hours later, many boat building attempts later, a lot of future later,